Oh boy, FNAF 4. Alright, well, this is where things get real complicated. The other 3 games before this, child's play compared to this. The lore for this game is so complicated that even to this day, we still can't agree on what it was trying to say. So I imagine this is where I might lose a lot of people, so I'm going to try and be as clear as possible. So as always, let's start with what actually happens during the game. During the nights, we have to fend off the nightmare animatronics, which are pretty self-explanatory, and at the end of each night we receive a cutscene showcasing the days leading up to a child's birthday party, a birthday party where he ultimately gets bitten and dies of his injuries in hospital at a later date.
Was that the bite of 87?
No, it isn't. Instead, this is the bite of 83. Through a secret Easter egg on the TV in the child's house, we can see the year 1983 on screen. But aside from that obvious detail, we can also tell this isn't the bite of 87 because during that incident, the animatronics were allowed to move around, whereas here, the animatronic that bites the child is on stage. And since this game takes place in 1983, that makes it the earliest to happen chronologically. It all sounds fairly straightforward, doesn't it? The kid is scared of animatronics, he has nightmares at night, and this is seemingly taking place before any tragedies have occurred. So why then is this game so complicated? It's because there are 2 narratives that we need to solve. Remember back in part 1 when I said that there was never an intent to make a 4th game because the story was finished? The primary reason for making this game was to end the series on a truly terrifying note, given how disappointed people were in the jump scares from the 3rd game. The problem that Scott had to figure out afterwards is how do you craft a story out of another game when your story was already finished, which resulted in him making a very controversial decision that all of the previous games were just mere dreams. An answer that had plenty of evidence supporting it, but regardless, it still had fans upset at the fact that all of this rich, dense story from the previous 3 games had all just been ultimately replaced with a very cheap, "it was a dream the whole time" answer. It wasn't until a year later when Scott decided to go back on this change and make the lore of the first 3 games canon again. But in doing so, FNAF 4 now had to find a new way to fit into this massive puzzle. And that's why I reckon this game is so complicated to understand. We must first figure out how every single detail from this game fit into that original narrative, and then figure out how it applies to the current narrative. Because of this, I feel it's finally appropriate to bring up Scott's infamous retcon. After the release of FNAF 5, Scott said that there was indeed one retcon that has ever been made to the story. However, this retcon has gone mostly unnoticed and accepted by the fanbase. So while that answer might initially make you want to pull your hair out, the fact that whatever this change was is something we actually approve of without us even realizing that it was different is a massive relief. So let's go over everything from that original story that is still canon today. First off, as always, who are we playing as? Initially, it may seem like we are playing as the child from the cutscenes. The kid is clearly scared of animatronics, we're having nightmares of animatronics. Open and shut case, right? Of course not. Nothing is ever that easy in this franchise. If we piece together all the little details, we can actually see that we are not playing as the crying child here, but instead, it's our longtime friend, Fritz Smith/Mike Schmidt, the crying child's older brother. How can we tell? A very odd inclusion to this game's audio is the phone guy's calls from FNAF 1, just slowed down significantly. Since the crying child died in 1983, 10 years earlier, there's no way he is having these nightmares. If that's the case though, then why is Fritz/Mike having nightmares of the animatronics? Well, since we're hearing the phone guy's calls from FNAF 1, that puts us post 1993, and at that point in time, Fritz/Mike has been fending off animatronics for years. It's no wonder he might have some PTSD over it all. Speaking of, this actually lines up with how all of these animatronics attack you in those games. Bonnie approaches from the left, Chica from the right, Freddy would show up behind you in your office, and Foxy jumps at you from out of the darkness. But the most important Easter eggs are at the bedside. Occasionally when you turn around, you'll see flowers, pills, or an IV bag. All imagery that Fritz/Mike wouldn't soon forget, since it was his fault that his brother ended up in that hospital bed, which finally tells us why our character has been coming back to these locations year after year. It's out of guilt. We're trying to make up for what we did all those years ago. Now let's talk about this crying child in more detail. He gets picked on by his older brother, he doesn't appear to have many friends, and he witnessed something that made him terrified of the animatronics. But despite all that, he does have somebody by his side.
Psychic friend Fredbear.
Someone is using the Fredbear plush to communicate with the child. But who could that be? Well, it seems like the intent behind this dialogue is to both reassure and look out for the child, comforting him when his fears get the better of him, both with his older brother scaring him and the animatronics in Fredbear's diner, which all seems to point to the idea that whoever's talking to the child is likely his parent. But if this is the crying child's parent, then why does he seem to let his oldest son bully him and get away with it? It's because he's literally too busy to take care of it, because the child's parent is the owner of Fredbear's diner. This actually helps to explain quite a lot of things. Why the crying child keeps coming back to the restaurant despite being scared. It's because it's his family's business. It also explains why their house is right next to Fredbear's. For a small independent business that's competing with a massive restaurant chain, as well as seeming to be a single parent with 3 kids to take care of, yes, 3, I'll get into that later, it only makes sense to set up shop right next door. And of course, it explains why the child has a Fredbear plush, despite again being scared of the animatronics. He wouldn't have wanted one, but his parent gave him one anyway so that they could keep an eye on him. But why keep an eye on him? This is where that third child comes into play. An empty girl's room doesn't seem like it would matter that much until you remember that the crying child saw something. Don't you remember what you saw? You know what will happen if he catches you. The crying child witnessed his sister's murder at the hands of the purple guy. And since we know the missing children's incident hasn't happened at this point, the only murder that this could be is the child who was killed outside of Fredbear's diner. The child that goes on to possess the puppet. The crying child isn't scared of the animatronics, he's scared of the purple guy. Because he works here too. The crying child knows what he did to his sister, and his parent is also wary of him, but is lacking concrete evidence to prove the purple guy is guilty. So you got all that? Good, because now it's time to throw it all in the trash, because here's how the retcon applies. If anyone was thinking that last section didn't sound right, this is why. That is what I propose was the original intent behind this game, when this was meant as the last one. But of course that's no longer the case. So, what is this retcon? Something that can fit into place so easily that it seemed intended from the start. The crying child's father was retconned to be the purple guy. Everything else I said about the crying child is still true. He did still witness the murder outside of Fredbear's diner. It's just now the 2 children are no longer related. The one talking to us in yellow text is still that kid's parent. They are just no longer our parent. They're also still the head of the business. What I love about this retcon is that it doesn't change any of the events of the story. It merely recontextualizes them. Beforehand, the missing children's incident seemed to be a random occurrence with no rhyme or reason behind it. But now, those children are the reason why the purple guy's youngest son is dead. And since the empty girl's room implies that he's also lost a daughter at this point, it makes a lot more sense why the purple guy would suddenly go on a killing spree, killing off the bullies responsible for his son's death, including his only remaining son. The end. For now. Wait, what? How on earth could Fritz/Mike have been killed? You said he's the main character of the entire series. How is that even possible? Anyway, it's sister location next week. Prepare for this series to jump the shark. and yet somehow land on its feet. Bye.